Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guest on this next interview. Ukraine entered its Independence Day under the threat of another major Russian aerial assault, while simultaneously demonstrating an expanding ability to strike deep inside Russia. Attacks on refineries and fuel infrastructure are increasingly producing tangible economic impacts, raising questions about escalation, deterrence, and Europe's response. Joining us today on TVP World to assess how this intensifying long-range war is changing the strategic balance is James Batchik, Deputy Director for EU Programs and Operations at the Atlantic Council. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So usually we do know that Russians are very big on dates and anniversaries, celebrations, things like that. Now, Ukraine is entering its Independence Day amid warnings of heightened Russian attacks. Now, how much additional danger does the symbolism of this anniversary actually carry?
That's a little bit uncertain. You're right. Tomorrow is the 35th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. Typically, in the past, these events have coincided with high-level visitors to the country. There are currently a large delegation of leaders from the Nordic Baltic countries in Ukraine, and as well as your U.S. officials, members of Congress, etc. And typically during these visits, Russian strikes against Kyiv, at least, have been muted. That is potentially changing. Just noted yesterday that when the German Foreign Minister Johann Vadeful was in the country, there was a ballistic strike targeted toward Kyiv, during the middle of the day. So there is the potential for the Russians to increase their attacks or to try to send a message here. But what I think is the more telling thing, if the Russians do try to escalate in any such way tomorrow, is how weak their hand is. You know, they are doing this because they are losing on the front line. Russian President Vladimir Putin has effectively stated as such, saying that they are responding and they need to attack Ukraine's infrastructure. In a way to kind of cover up for this snail pace, or that they're advancing on the front lines, or even losing territory on the front lines. So I think the dates are a big deal, and it's an opportunity for escalation. But let's not forget just how weak in a position the Russians are in right now.
Can you help us understand that a little bit? You mentioned a potential strike might actually show its hand and show how weak Russia is. But also, like you mentioned earlier, there's a pretty big delegation in Ukraine right now. So wouldn't striking at this moment risk some sort of escalation and show boldness instead of weakness?
Well, the Russians have shown that they have an appetite for escalation. Just look at the recent incidents we've had over the summer, where Russian drones and other incursions have entered into NATO airspace. So we're seeing that the Russians do have an appetite for that escalation. But at the same time, I don't think they would be doing this with such fanfare if there weren't such a bad news on the front lines that they're trying to cover up. The Russians are losing around 1,000 people a month. They have not gained any territory. They've actually lost territory on the front in the month of August. Some colleagues at the Institute for the Study of War have documented. So I think what we have to see here is that this is effectively someone in the corner lashing out. Couple this negative news that we're seeing on the front with the real economic problems that the Russian economy is facing. As you mentioned, the Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries have dropped production by around 30%. That is causing a serious crunch for the Russians' war revenues. So all of these point to serious problems that the Russians are being backed into. So what it means to show that they do have strength and do have cards to play, they might try to escalate. So we shouldn't be deterred or confused about what message is really being sent by any sort of Russian provocation.
All right, actually expanding on that, you just mentioned Ukrainian attacks on the Russian refinery. Now, we're seeing like long queues, hour-long lines. When this first took place, some of our analysts says that, well, the Russian military might actually feel it last due to the way they are rationing fuel. But do you think at this point we are at a point where the campaign of Ukrainian strikes crossing the threshold from just simple harassment to genuine strategic damage?
I think we are seeing a deterioration with these strikes, a deterioration of the Russian ability to make war. Let's not pretend that tomorrow the Russian economy is going to fully collapse. It is effectively operating at the whims of the state. And you're right, much of the economy has been dedicated toward the war effort and will continue to do so, frankly, at the expense of the overall long-term health of the economy or for the health of the consumer economy in the country. But we are seeing serious problems. As I mentioned, Ukraine's revenues or state revenues are way down. They have lost around 30% of their operating capacity for petrol. For petrol, there's rationing inside the country. We're also seeing problems with chemical refineries as well. So I think you are starting to see some real problems here. I mean, some of the statistics that we're seeing coming out of Russia are pretty harrowing. Their oil and gas revenues are down 64% from 2 years ago. Their fiscal deficit has ballooned trillions of rubles. That's doubled than in the same time last year. So we are starting to see some of these structural problems come into play that has frankly been a result of these strikes, but also sanctions against the country, the oil price cap that the EU has, and actions against the shadow fleet. So you are seeing some real problems and cracks in the Russian economy.
All right. And speaking of these Ukrainian deep strikes within Russia, now it does remind me of some Western governments that spent years worried about like long-range strikes in Russia might create some sort of dangerous escalation. Now, with the power of hindsight in their hands, do you think that those worries and fears were justified, or did it excessive caution kind of unnecessarily constrain Ukraine back then?
In my position, I think that the way that the Ukrainians had their hands tied in the last couple of years, and frankly still are. I mean, there's sort of reports of the U.S. administration asking Kyiv to not target certain areas that might have relations with U.S. oil producers. Did degrade Ukraine's ability to make some changes on the battlefield. I think we should be very, very clear to that effect. And I think it's a good lesson learned that the Ukrainians, when we let them operate and take defense into their own hands and totally into their own hands, that they're going to create some serious problems for the Russians. And I would not be as worried about deterrence as we have been in the past.
Right. Now, on the other hand, Russia has also threatened retaliation against Ukraine's economic infrastructure. But we've already seen Russian hit energy, water, and there's also rumors about this coming winter being a harsh one because of more attack on civilian infrastructure as well. Do you think at this point they still have any other levers to pull, or are these threats pretty much just empty?
Well, I think we should be clear that these attacks are just a continuation of the deliberate attacks against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure that has been going on since February of 2022, when the full-scale invasion took place. We should be very clear that the Russians have been doing this from the get-go and will continue to do so. So I think those threats are real. I think what we're seeing now is the increased lethality of those attacks because of Ukraine's lacking of air defenses, and we are seeing, I think there is some concern over what will happen into the winter when the Russians do continue their attacks on civilian and energy infrastructure, for example, and what that means for how can civilians heat their homes or have enough food for the winter, have enough water for the winter as well. So there is real reason to be concerned, not because these are Russian new threats, but because the Russians have shown that they are willing to do so and will probably do so. Really, what's missing now is an adequate air defense that the Ukrainians desperately need in order to stop those attacks.
All right, speaking of air defense, well, we've seen recently that Ukrainians are really struggling with ammunition amidst like dwindling supply of Patriot air defense missiles. Looking at Europe, though, its economy has vastly outweighed Russia's, yet Ukraine's still very dependent heavily on outside support, that of the United States, for example, for air defense and other critical capabilities. Why has Europe struggled to translate its economic strength into comparable military capacity?
Well, this is a big question, and it goes well beyond Ukraine, and it's a decades-old question here. We're looking at a very acute issue right now of air defense and missile defense, because it's a production issue. The past 30 years, we've seen a dismantling, effectively, of the defense industrial space, both in Europe and the United States, to be very clear. And now trying to spin up these factories, the know-how, the IP, it takes time. And unfortunately, there is going to be a gap between the time it takes to spin these up, even at a highly advanced timeline, and the rate at which the Ukrainians need them now. I mean, that I think is essentially the problem. You're right. There is plenty of money. but there are much more institutional problems that have led to production to kind of just trickle off. And now that we're seeing a need to have a deep well of air defense and also a continual production lines of air, particularly air defense in this case, we're starting to see some movements of investment into these. But again, the problem here is going to be time. You've seen efforts by the Europeans, in particular, to work with the Ukrainians to develop some indigenous and really support Ukraine's indigenous anti-ballistic missiles that they're working on, as well as the Ukrainians are looking to use some of this EU money that they received, this 90 billion euro loan, for air defense orders. But those probably, the public reporting says the announcement won't even be made until September, and then those orders would come in maybe earliest of next year. So you're seeing, again, that gap, as I was saying, is really the problem here in between of what Ukraine needs now and, what can be spun up in the immediate time before, orders start to come in more regularly.
All right. Well, looking at the span of this war, Ukraine has been developing a drone or new weapon at an extraordinary speed and scale as well. Is there a possibility where these money, instead of using towards making orders, be invested into Ukraine's own production, and utilize these innovation and these kind of high turnover that they have?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, just today, Finnish President Alexander Stubb is in the country, and there was a deal with a Finnish company announcing a co-production and developing Ukrainian drones in Finland. So we are seeing this develop, and there is a significant appetite to work with Ukraine to leverage their know-how, their experience. I mean, over the last 4+ years, Ukraine unfortunately has been a battlefield experiment that we're seeing so much innovation happen on a near daily basis. So a lot of effort is being used to figure out what can we learn, what has worked, what has not, and how do things need to change. And a lot of that will include things like drones or unmanned aerial vehicles, unmanned ground vehicles as well. A significant portion, however, still needs to focus on, for example, anti-missile defense, and how that should adapt to respond to, for example, massive drone incursions. But you are still going to need systems to respond to the Russian ballistics, hypersonics, and cruise missiles that are being lobbed against Ukraine.
Right, and speaking of the ballistic missile, well, right now it does still seem like Patriot defense system and the PAC-3 variant is some of the more reliable equipment to shoot these, intercept these ballistic missiles. But we also see an uncertainty grow around long-term American involvement. Do you think that Europe eventually will be able to kind of fill those shoes and develop kind of capabilities in order to create any sort of credible air defense?
Well, Europe does have some tools and some kit that may not be at the level of the Patriot or the PAC-3, but are useful, and we've been used in the battlefield. I'm speaking and thinking specifically of the Franco-Italian project, the SAMP-T air defense system. In some cases, it's worked particularly well, and you're seeing Ukraine have a real desire to put in orders for the SAMP-T. This is not to say that the Patriot system is somehow going to be defunct. It's certainly not. But I do think you are seeing, one, a certain baseline that Europe does have some of these capabilities. Again, it's a production issue that I mentioned. But I think in the long term, if U.S. kit is seen unreliable and Europe continues to work with the Ukrainians, I suspect you'll see Ukrainian and European kit maybe leapfrog and really have some strong advances, technical advances, because they can be used and tested on the battlefield, and leveraged with Ukrainian knowledge and innovative skill.
Great. Thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thank you.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.